Okay, thank you so much, Shira, for those kind words and for this kind invitation. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with all of you today, coming live from Israel. And I'm looking forward to, I hope will be a tremendous learning experience for me and for you and a great conversation. So I think we titled the class, I think appropriately for what we want to cover, but what we titled the class was Halakha Public Policy and End of Life Dilemmas. And as you see, we're going to be touching on some of the sensitive, very sensitive topics that come up. These would be sensitive topics, even without the public debates that go on about them, just because the nature of some of the conversations that are going on in life and death. But certainly, these are also topics of real relevance to the political condition and the political atmosphere of our times. We'll be getting into some of these in depth as we go along, and euthanasia and active euthanasia and organ donation and other issues as well. And I'm very excited to learn and study with you and think about these topics. These are topics of real interest to me. They've been for many years. I actually grew up in a home of a bioethicist. My father, Lava Shalom, Professor Baruch Brody, was a professor of bioethics for 40 years, Baylor College of Medicine, Houston. And so I have the distinct pleasure. I think I could be I'm the only one in the world who's actually has this pleasure. I have the distinct pleasure that my bar mitzvah drasha was about abortion and suicide and Jewish thought. I don't know how many other people can say that they dedicated their bar mitzvah drasha to abortion, suicide, and Jewish thought. And so, I've been thinking about these issues for a long time. Certainly now it's my organization at Halakha Organ Donor Society, which is rebranding and broadening out to end-of-life care issues as a whole. I'm thinking about these issues in great depth, and I'm looking forward to get right into these topics with you. Now, the one topic that I purposely did not put on end-of-life categories was abortion. And the reason is I know people sort of usually categorize abortion as beginning of life. Although depending on how you look at the question of abortion, you could also think of it as the end of life or taking life, depending on how you think about it. And it's actually precisely that topic, which we'll touch upon a little bit today. I want to just state from the outset, precisely because we're dealing with such sensitive topics, I want to put out there, like I'm trying to create a conversation, right? We want to have a open dialogue and open understanding here. This isn't the Knesset or the Canadian Parliament or the U.S. House of Representatives, right? So I think we can, it's not exactly setting a high bar for discourse and dialogue to say we can do better than that. Sadly. But nonetheless, I'm fully confident that we'll be at a higher level than that, for better and for worse. Okay, so what I want to do is explain a little bit of the structure for a moment. And the premise of the class, the course, in some ways, although this is something we're going to be thinking about throughout, is that Jewish law, not in Jewish thought in general, and Jewish law in particular, has something to say about the issues that are going on in hand in public society. A, that we have something to say about these issues, and B, that Jews should share what we have to say and try to be active participants in terms of bringing Jewish ideas to the public square. Now, when I say that we have something to say and we should bring these ideas to the public square, I want to put there out there from the get-go, I am, of course, not suggesting that Judaism believes that whatever goes on in Canada or America or England or wherever else people are here, we'll get to Israel momentarily, is bound by Jewish law. I'm not making that such a claim, but more a modest claim, which is to say that what we have has something to say to the world, and we should say it. We have something to say, and we should say it. But before we make that point, I think we should ask if that's actually true. Okay? Is it really true that we have something to say and we should say it? Or maybe we should say that what Jews have to say about these issues is really meant for just the Jews, is meant for us. What the world does, it's what the world does. And maybe we should have an influence on that or care about that. but it's not the role of Judaism, let alone the Jews, but Judaism at least, in order to try to impact the public policy of what goes on in the world. And as we're going to see, this is actually, I think, a complex question, which isn't such a simple one to answer. And I hopefully we'll explore that in today's class in particular. Okay, so today's class is very much going to be focused on understanding why it is that this class makes sense in the first place. Right? Does Judaism have to say about something about these topics? And does it have something to say which we think we should share with the world? And then in the coming weeks, we'll explore specific topics. So I want to share with you and start up with a moment here with a passage that comes here from Robert George. Robert George is a Catholic thinker. He's probably the leading Catholic intellectual in the United States, maybe in one of the leading intellectuals in the world, certainly, and particularly when it comes to issues of public policy matters. Anytime if you're an archbishop in America and you want to say something about public policy, there's a good chance you've consulted with Robert George. It's probably even a better chance he actually wrote your speech. Okay, so he's highly influential. If you look up his whole profile about the New York Times 3 years ago, I happen to know Rabbi. He's a really wonderful human being and teacher at Princeton. Okay, so he has this concept they call the concept of public morality. Okay, and here's what he means by the concept of public morality. The common good of public morality, that is, the good of a healthy moral ecology, generates obligations and justice for all of us, just as do the common goods of public health and safety. So let's think about this for a moment. We're all familiar with the concept of ecology, right? The notion of saying that our environment, what's going on in our physical environment, has an impact on our physical health. And therefore, because it has an impact on our physical health, we should, of course, care about the state of the air quality or the water quality or whatever else it might be, right? Ecology has an impact on our lives. But what about the moral ecology? Okay. And what he's referring to here, Rabbi, is this idea that somehow what's going on in the rest of the world, what's in the air, so to speak, right? What we're breathing in and intaking from the society, from the media, from movies, from conversations at the water cooler, whatever it might be, whatever these ideas that we're taking in also impacts us. And therefore, we should care very much not just about the quality of the air, but also the ecology. Okay? And George's claim is basically to say that, yes, we should care very, very much about the moral ecology. Right? And he goes on to say, listen, the moral ecology by and large gets impacted by what goes on in schools, on civic society, volunteer groups, right? It's not always a matter of law. If you want to impact society, the way to do that is not always by law. In fact, sometimes law with its coercive powers is not the way to impact the moral ecology. But law has a role, right? Law plays a role in this broader project of caring about public morality or the moral ecology. Now I ask myself, does Judaism agree with this idea, right? That there's a moral ecology, and the moral ecology, which isn't just in the Jewish world, right? But it's clearly in something much broader, right? In the broader society, is that something that we should care about? And particularly not just in culture, but also in law as a whole. Okay. And I think the answer to that question, initially at least, I think, to me, is yes. Right? There is this notion of saying that Jews should care that there's some basic laws and standards in the broader society. In general, there are a number of different ways of formulations of how you might see this in Jewish thought. But I think the classic formulation of this is known as the Shiva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. Now, there's actually a disagreement in the Talmud. What are the seven Noahide laws. Okay, and for those of you who are interested on this topic, you can read by the classic book of this is by someone named David Novak. Who can see it. David's from Toronto, The Image of Non-Jew in Judaism, but there have been other good books about this as well. And we'll come back to David's thought in a moment. But the seven Noahide laws appears in the Gemara and the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin. I will try to get some source sheets up to you sideways momentarily, but in the meantime, let's just look on the screen together. And the Gemara tells us what the seven mitzvahs b'nei Noach are. There should be a legal system, dinim, birkat Hashem. There should be a prohibition of blasphemy. And then you have the big three: idol worship, illicit relations, and murder, gezel, stealing, and ever min hachai, right? Taking a limb from a live animal. Okay, all of these are the seven mitzvot, and according to some, seven categories even of laws which apply to Jews and non-Jews alike. Now, if that's the case, this would seem to say that Judaism has some notion, at least, of thinking that non-Jews should keep a certain legal standard, and we should care about that. But it's one thing to say this is a nice idea, right? But if you really want to know, right, that this is something we care about, you'd ask the following question: suppose a non-Jew would come to you and say, Nancy. Right? Nancy Paris, I see you right here. How you doing, Nancy? Okay, so Nancy, a non-Jew, where are you from, Nancy? If you don't mind, take off your unmute for a second.
Silver Spring, Maryland.
Silver Spring, Maryland has mostly civil people, but nonetheless, let's go with this question. Mostly, it's also close to DC, so Anyway, but let's take the following question, Nancy. Your local neighbor comes to you and says, non-Jewish neighbor comes to you and says to you, Nancy, can you please hand me this Aver min hachai, this limb from the live animal? I would like to consume that today. Right? That's a funny question, but let's just assume it's happening. Okay, Nancy, would you be allowed to hand over that Aver min hachai, that limb? Would you be allowed to give it to the non-Jew for the sake of consuming it?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Correct. Right. Excellent. Right. So. This is indeed what the Gemara tells us, and this is actually a classic source. We have this concept called lifnei iver. Before the blind, don't place a stumbling block. Lifnei iver lo titen mechshol. And the classic example which the Gemara gives of this phenomenon in Avodah Zarah says, if a non-Jew tells you, give me an Aver min hachai, are you allowed to do it? The answer is no, it's prohibited. Okay? So from here we see that there's this important notion of saying that you cannot help a non-Jew commit one of the seven Noahide laws. Okay, before we even, let's keep that in the background, because if you think, let's say, abortion is prohibited to non-Jews, because abortion is included shvichut damim, or if you think that euthanasia is applicable to non-Jews, because it's in shvichut damim, right? So all of a sudden you see, this Gemara has a lot of implications. We're going to make things a lot more complicated as we go along. But, the Aver min hachai issue is the least of the issues, okay? But the Gemara then goes on and says the following. And here I see a question from Ovadia in which he says, wait a minute, does that mean I can't drive my non-Jewish neighbor to church? Let's assume for a moment, for our purposes right now, that it is Avodah Zarah. It's a different discussion. I'm sure Mark Shapiro can talk to you all about that in a different Torah motion class. Okay? And would you be able to drive a non-Jew to church? And the Gemara here tells us the following. The prohibition of lifnei iver only applies if the non-Jews on the other side of the river. We'll call it the two sides of the river clause. What it means is that the non-Jew is on one side of the river, the object which he needs, let's say the Aver min hachai, the limb, is on the other side, and you can give it to him. You can facilitate his ability to violate that law because you're on the side of the river with the limb and you hand it over to him. However, if he could easily pick up, or she, right, could easily do it on their own, and they're just asking you for help, but they could do this on their own without your help. And they don't really need you to do this. Then the Gemara says it's not a violation of lifnei iver. So let's take a moment, think about the implications. I think the way to think about this is what the Gemara is telling us is that lifnei iver is a violation of facilitating the act. Because of your help, you're making it possible, right? So the other classic example the Gemara gives is if a Nazir, who's Nazarite, is prohibited from drinking wine, and he says to you, or she says to you, you can be a Nazirah as well, right? Give me a cup of wine, and that's the only way they have access to it. You are violating lifnei iver. But if they can have the wine anyway, they just go into the fridge. That's not lifnei iver. Wow, that would seem to be pretty broad, right? And according to that logic, that would say that anytime a non-Jew can do one of these laws on their own, then there's no problem of helping them. And in fact, medieval Jewry seems to have ruled that way, because when it comes to non-Jews, there is this concept of aiding and abetting. In Hebrew, it's called misayeah. But the Ramah brings down the following law. Suppose a non-Jew would come to you, you're hardware, you sell trinkets, okay, you're a salesman or trinkets. And this seems to be an actual real question in medieval times. And the non-Jew says to you, can you sell me a crucifix that I can hang up in my home, or I can bring to church, or a wafer, or something else that they'll use in a part of their religious rituals? Are you allowed to sell it to them? Answers the Rambam, yes, right? You can. Why? So the Shach explains over here. Look at the Rambam here. If they can get it from somewhere else, the non-Jew, on their own, you can sell them whatever they want. Which means that if the non-Jew says, right, let's leave aside different religions. Let's say someone's a pagan, and the pagan simply comes and says, I want you to sell me what I need to do paganism, right? My pagan worship, which is clearly avodah zarah. Are you allowed to do it? The answer seems to be yes. Why? Because they could do it anyway. So let's take implications of this for a moment. There is a famous case in the United States a few years ago called the Masterpiece Bake Shop. It was the Masterpiece Bake Shop case. Anyone remember? Right? It's a religious.
It's a wedding cake, isn't it, for per gay couple? And the bakery owners did not believe in gay marriage, and so they didn't want to make the cake.
Exactly, right? So this is a case of regular customers, quite friendly, and the owners of the bake shop said, listen, I'm happy you guys be customers, come here, serve you, but I can't make a cake, celebrate this union. And I don't remember if it was going to be in the end, they'd have to write something. I think that was also one of the issues. So be like, congratulations, whatever it might be. But either way, he objected to it. It was a whole big deal in the Supreme Court, etc. And the question came up, well, let's say you were a Jewish bake shop owner. I'm not getting to the issue of homosexuality and Judaism today. I'm not really. I've got enough controversial topics in this class. I really want to go there. But nonetheless, let's say you're a bake shop owner. Would this be a problem? And the obvious answer is absolutely not. A, there's no prohibition of eating cake. Right? Let's just put it out there, right? There's no prohibition of eating cake. Right? Just sometimes a cake is just a cake. Right? It's just a cake. And B, but beyond that issue, if they didn't buy it from you, they could buy it from someone else. Right. So, but even, I remember once reading, in the 50s, that if you were a hotel or motel owner, someone came and it was clear, a couple walks in, and it's pretty clear to you that both of them are married, but not to each other. Are you allowed to rent them a hotel room? Answer is, it's mutter. Why is it mutter? Because, right, let's assume we're talking about non-Jews right now. Because while this might be a terrible act, right, but it's not you that is making it possible to facilitate adultery. Okay, so on the one hand, this law of saying that lifnei iver only applies when you are facilitating it, right? But aiding and abetting, that which can be done anyway, is not a problem allows a lot of flexibility, right? It allows a lot of room to say, listen, on the one hand, we can't do something directly to them, right? Facilitate an Avera, which raises issues, and we'll get to this. Abortion, euthanasia will come up, and this is a big issue for the Canadians here right now because of physicians feeling compelled one form or another to help with physician-assisted suicide. We'll talk about this later on, right? But when it comes to just aiding and abetting, something which can go on anyway, here there seemingly is not a problem. And so this would seemingly, so someone asked earlier, could I drive my elderly neighbor to church? The answer is yes, because they can get to church anyway, right? Suppose a Jewish baker refuses to write Jesus Saves. Well, see, that's interesting because if you were writing Jesus Saves, you could argue, right, that the fact that you have to write this is a problem for Jews. I mean, let's say someone comes to the bake shop owner and say, please write in Hebrew, Yud K Vav K. Right? You can imagine you can come up with all sorts of interesting theoretical cases where this would be a problem for you. But someone writes here, in Toronto for many years, Jews were in the church furnishing and equipment business, supplying synagogue with Menachem pews and churches with cross pews. I know one such who is still alive. So would that be mutter? The answer is as a mafurish, explicit Rabbi. That is mutter. Why? A, because sitting in church isn't a Avodah anyway, well, even if you would say it is, and B, if they didn't get the bench from you, they could get it from somewhere else. Okay, so this on a legal technical level seems to allow for a lot of flexibility. But as someone's already writing in the chat here and pointing out, these cases get to much larger issues, and yes, they do. I absolutely agree with that because there's part of the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, if it's going on in society, as long as we're not facilitating it, is it really not a problem? I mean, let's take the example of adultery. Okay, we have a mature crowd here, so we'll talk about these topics, right? So you have the example of adultery. Adultery is rampant in broader society. Is that should Jews just say, well, listen, whatever's going on in broader society is what's going on in broader society. As long as Jews aren't committing adultery or facilitating adultery, this is not an issue of Jewish concern. I think about it. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, should we be concerned about it or not? Now, I happen to think we should be. And I'm going to give a number of reasons why that's the case. But I think much of it relates to and goes back to this idea earlier that the moral ecology matters. What's going on in our society matters and impacts us. Okay? And as I'm going to try to argue right now, it doesn't just impact us, it impacts the world in ways which should be of concern. In other words, what's going on in broader society, even if you said that we could be hermetically sealed from such influences, right, is nonetheless a matter of Jewish concern. And I want to try to prove this point right now by highlighting some of the comments that commentators made throughout the centuries over the 7 Noahide laws. In other words, even if the Gemara is correct, and we assume that so much the Gemara is correct, but we follow the Talmudic law, which says that as long as you're not facilitating it, it's not a problem for Jews, right, to be helped, aid, and abet, and it's not an issue per se, right? In other words, let's just make a comparison. Do Jews have an obligation to try to convince fellow Jews to keep mitzvot? It's a big issue, it's a big topic, right? But I think, and by and large, the answer that people usually say to answer this question is yes, right? So Jews have an obligation and care about, fellow Jews keeping mitzvot. Okay, this brings up all sorts of issues, right? Of compelling, enforcing, and how do you convince, and kiruv, and okay, not our topic for now, but in general, that is the assumption. So I don't know how many of you are following Israeli politics, but one of the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox parties yesterday and was enraged that there was not that the railroad, the metro, the building of the metro in Tel Aviv, new light rail, is ongoing on Shabbat. He was sort of outraged about this issue. Okay? The premise is that we have to care about the fact that the Jewish workers are violating Shabbat. Okay? Now, when it comes to non-Jews, do we have such an obligation? Okay, so we've seen until now, right, that at best we have lifnei iver, but we certainly don't have a problem of aiding and abetting. And the question becomes, well, does that mean that we shouldn't care what goes on? So if we take a look at some of the sources, I'm not going to go inside a lot of these, but there's a number of arguments made for why we should care nonetheless. Okay, and the first source is from Sefer Hasidim. This is 12th century Germany, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, and he has a very interesting line. He says, listen, if you see a non-Jew violating one of their mitzvot, should you be moche, right? Should you protest? Should you give tochacha? Should you give rebuke? Okay, so when it comes to a Jew, we have the mitzvah of tochacha, of rebuke. So you see someone violating Shabbat. I'm not getting all the details here, and let's say you assume that they would care, right? So you'd say, hey, you're violating Shabbat, stop doing that. What about for a non-Jew? So the Yehuda Chassid says, in general, it's a good idea, right? In other words, he has this idea that if you see them doing this and you could protest, you should protest. And he gives a very interesting proof case. Jonah, the prophet Jonah, right? Where did he go and prophesy to? Nineveh. Who lived in Nineveh? Non-Jews. And so what the Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says is you see that there's this notion of importance of non-Jews keeping the law, and we have responsibility if they'll listen to protest to them as well. Okay, that's a very interesting model. Now the question is why? Why would that be the case? So one model you can argue comes up actually a formulation of the Rambam. The Rambam says as follows: says non-Jews we saw in the 7 mitzvahs of Noach is they have to set up a court system, dinim, and they should have laws. So the Rambam in Perek Yud of Hilchot Melachim says that it's important that they should have a court system to adjudicate those laws, kedei shelo yishachet ha'olam, so that the world will not be destroyed. But what does he mean by this? So I think the simplest explanation is that the Rambam is saying, Maimonides is arguing, that when if you don't have a system of law, right? If you don't have a system of law, so the world gets destroyed, there's chaos, there's anarchy. And even if that wouldn't impact the Jews, that in its own right is a bad thing. And the Jews should care what goes on in the world. And the destruction of the moral society, of civic society, is a bad thing in its own right, and this is what the Rambam is saying. So one explanation here is to simply say that the reason why you have to care about the moral, what's going on, the moral ecology of the public morality, what's going on in the world, is simply because it has a destructive effect on the world, and that'll be very bad. That's just bad in its own right. Okay, but later on, many centuries later, the Maharam Shik of Moshe Schick pointed out something else, which I think is so true and so important. Okay, and he said the following. He said, "Listen, whatever goes on in society, broader society, also impacts Jewish behavior. Like, who are you kidding? Right? You think that, if there's, let's give an example of adultery. You think if there's widespread adultery in broader society, that also doesn't impact how Jews behave. Of course it does. Right? Whatever's going on in broader society in one form or another, and this is true no matter how secluded you might try to be, right? Nonetheless, that is going to impact the Jews. And therefore, if we don't care about what goes on in broader society, understand that it's going to come into our circles as well. Right? I think there's a tremendous insight the Maram Shix, which I think is just empirically. I don't know how you measure this, right? But I think it's empirically true. Right? Trends that go on in broader society impact Jewish society. So, there are all sorts of things that go on in the world that have changed the way that we live, and that has impacted Jews as well. And this doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox or non-Orthodox, you're Haredi, you're Hasidic, you're Reform, Reconstructionist, doesn't matter, right? In one form or another, right, there is certainly a great amount of impact. Okay? And so if we care about the world being destroyed, right, the behavior of the world destruction, and we care about how it impacts the Jews, there may be one other factor as well why we really should care about what's going on in broader society. And I'll take a look at some of the questions. And this is an interesting idea that comes up from Rav Yom Tov Littman Heller, Tosfot Yom Tov, in his commentary to Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, Mishnah Perek Gimel, has one of the more famous Mishnayot, which says that Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem. Precious are human beings. Here it's clearly referring to Jews and non-Jews alike. Precious are human beings who were created in the image of God. And it's even better that they're even told that. And where are we told that human beings are created in the image of God? Shneimar B'Tzelem Elohim Asa et ha'adam. Now, this is very interesting. It quotes Bereshit Perek Tet. Bereshit Perek Tet is in Parashat Noach. Parashat Noach, my Bar Mitzvah Parsha, right? Bereshit Perek Tet is where we learn the 7 Noahide laws from, right? That's where it's darshaned out in the Gemara. Is that the first time where the notion of Tzelem Elohim comes up in the Torah? No, right? Tzelem Elohim comes up much earlier. Ruth, I see you're pointing it correctly, right? Tzelem Elohim comes up much earlier in the Torah. If that's the case, why does the Mishnah quote specifically the notion of Tzelem Elohim in Perek Tet? And so the Tosfot Yom Tov, of Yom Tov in Heller, argues and says, listen, part of what it means of being created in the image of God, and part of what the Jewish teaching that all human beings were created in the image of God means that human beings have a certain moral responsibility in the ways they act. And therefore, part of the message that we're trying to teach to Jews and non-Jews alike is that you should aspire for great moral and ethical behavior. This is part of the Jewish teaching to the world. This is part of what we're trying to spread to the world, that human dignity, the fact that we are created in the image of God, calls upon us precisely to use that divine image to do good acts. And so if you'd ask me, well, is this a Jewish value that non-Jews should behave in a moral way? The answer is, of course it is, because that is precisely the implication of the grand Jewish teaching that all human beings were created in the divine image. Right, so I think we have here.
On the other hand, we know that Kadosh Baruch Hu אין לו גוף ואין לו דמות הגוף.
Right, so yeah, okay, so exactly what this notion of Tzelem Elohim means is a whole course in its own right, right, correct, and but for our purposes right now, the concept is trying to stress. Let's assume for our purpose right now, the concept is trying to stress that there's a rational choice that human beings have and how they behave, and this is something which all human beings have. This is something the Torah is trying to teach to everyone. And therefore, you should use that rational choice, behave in a moral manner. So we have here 3 different key arguments of understanding why it's important for Jews to care about whether the non-Jews, the broader population, are functioning and behaving in a moral manner. A, because they'll be destructive to the world. Right? Just there's a lot of people killing each other. If everyone's stealing from each other, that's bad. B, because whatever goes on in broader society impacts us as well and our behavior. And C, at the end of the day, this is precisely what actually the mission of Judaism is. is to teach people to embrace the human dignity and embrace your divine image, to behave properly. So if we would say we don't care about how people behave, that's basically abandoning the entire Jewish image. Okay. Now, yeah, so I'm looking at a couple of the questions here. Yeah, I mean, Eric is pointing out here, about behavior. Correct? Yes, there's certain behaviors. Sure. Yeah, but certain behaviors will go on in broader society, will go on Jewish society as well. And yes, it impacts us, right? It impacts the way we behave. Now, Steve is asking a very interesting question here, which is a different topic in its own right, which goes into the question of gun stores. And let's think about it for a moment. According to what we're saying right now, I grew up in Texas, so I don't know if any of the Texans here, but in Texas, it's not very hard to buy a gun. Can a Jew own a gun store in Texas? Okay, so this is a very interesting question, right? And you could say, listen, if you don't own the store, you don't sell it, they'll just go to the next street corner and get it, right? It's not hard to get a gun in Texas. It's not hard to get a gun in Illinois and a lot of places as well in America, but I'm just picking on Texas gun real quick. Okay, so you could say, right, okay, but you could also say, you're going to own a gun store and know what people do with it. Should we care, like, about that broader society and what's going on with guns? Right, so you understand what's at stake here. And in fact, since somebody brings that case up, so there is a famous assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan in the early 80s. And the attempted assassin, bought his gun from a Jewish man who owned a pawn shop in Dallas. And at the time, I think it was in 1982 when this publication came out. I think the assassination attempt was in 81, if I'm not mistaken, Hinckley. And Rabbi J. David Bleich of Yeshiva University wrote an open letter to the Jewish pawn shop owner where he said, how dare you, right? You think, guns don't kill people. People kill people. He's like, what are you talking about? People do kill people, and they kill people because they have guns. You shouldn't sell guns to people that use them inappropriately. Okay, so this is a much broader question. If it's might not be technically a violation of Lifnei Iver, but does that mean that's a good business for you to be in? Right, and this relates to much other questions. If you look up online, Shlomo Brody, gun control, you'll see I have a whole bunch of articles on precisely that topic. Okay. Oh, arms dealers. Yeah, I have an article on arms dealing as well. All right. Well, next, Shira, next course I give for Torah in Motion, we'll talk about guns and arms trades and this and that. Okay. So let's just summarize where we're at right now, because what we've tried to set up here is this paradigm. On the one hand, we're not necessarily obligated to try to convince non-Jews to keep the 7 mitzvahs in law. And as long as we're not facilitating it, it seems to not be a problem. In fact, we could even aid and abet. On the other hand, we have many good reasons why we should care quite a lot what's going on in that broader society. That being the case, how does this impact how we behave and think about when it comes to public policy? So I should mention, there is one posek, posek is the right term here, but there's one important rabbinic figure in the 20th century who made a big deal and said, Jews should spread the Noahide laws to the non-Jews. We should be teaching it. We should try to be convincing them to keep it. It's very important. Right? And as you might not be surprised to hear, that rabbinic figure was the Lubavitcher Rebbe Zatzal, right? Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who, as part of his broader missionary, right? I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, right? But in part of his missionary vision, felt that Jews have an active responsibility to teach non-Jews, and we should act upon that, right? The value and importance of keeping the Shiva mitzvahs and Noah. If I'm not mistaken, in several occasions in the 80s, the United States Congress passed a 7 Noahide laws, declaration days in honor of Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? In order, right, because he was trying to promote this, the value of this. I don't know if any of you are from Australia, but when I've had taught this topic, different variations of it to my Australian students, Australian Jewish day schools are very impacted by Chabad, and they all know this. Like, of course, we have to right? And I point out to them, well, he was the only one who said it, right? Which tells you something. But that was his opinion. And in general, we don't. Most poskim, most Jewish thinkers don't think that there's any form of imperative to spread the 7 Noahide laws. Now, let's think about how this may or may not impact public policy. Okay, and let's pick a topic which I think is an easy one, but it's complicated: religious liberty. Okay, religious liberty. In general, many times before a House of Parliament, whether it's in England or America or in Canada or other places we might be here. So there'll be a question that comes up, should Jews support religious liberty laws or laws that protect you from discrimination, whatever it might be, in the workplace or somewhere else based on your religious identity? How many of you think, just give me a show of hands, that Jews should support, whether it's in Congress or Parliament, whatever it might be, Jews should support laws that protect religious liberty? Yeah, right. Most people say, yeah, of course, right? We should support laws that protect religious liberty. I want to give you all a big clap of hands. You just supported paganism. Well done. Thank you very much. Good job, everyone. Now, why do I say that? I'm not being sarcastic one bit. Right, because there is a growing, you can Google this, and you can find, right, there's plenty of modern day form of pagan ritual worship that goes on today. I see Shira's already looking up here. What's going on with this Brody? Why isn't it so much about paganism? I told you, Shira, I'm from Texas. I know all about this stuff. In any case, right, so if you look this up, you will see that there's a growing amount of paganism around, and there are probably more pagans in the United States than there are Jews. So every time, right, we support religious liberty, many times, in fact, the cases come up with all sorts of animal worship, this, that, whatever it might be. And the question becomes, aren't you just facilitating and helping Avodah Zarah? And the answer is no, we're not facilitating it. They can do it anyway. And it is in the Jewish interest to protect, right, our religious liberty. If that also means protecting the religious liberty of Ovdei Avodah Zarah, of idol worshippers, okay. That's part of the trade-off. That's the complications of living in the Western political society. Right. You could take that approach. Okay. So now let's take a more sensitive question, which comes to the question of abortion. Okay. Now, I have no desire in the last 12 minutes of this class to get into the question of what does Judaism say about abortion. Okay. If you look up Shlomo Brody, abortion, you can see all sorts of, in the Federalist, I wrote an article there, trying to lay out and articulate what Jews actually have to say, or Jews must say about this topic. I think many would agree, not most, many would agree that there are many cases of abortions which under Jewish law would not necessarily be permitted. I actually don't think that's a non-controversial, I think it's a pretty non-controversial statement. You could argue. I know all this. I got it. I know this is a complex issue, but I think that most people would agree that there are sometimes that certain laws would be, certain abortions would be prohibited under Jewish law, but are protected by various government laws, whether it's in Canada, England, or now in some states of the United States. Okay. Now, historically, when abortion laws cases came up to the Supreme Court or state courts, what did Orthodox Jewish groups say on the topic of Roe v. Wade before Dobbs? Did the Orthodox Jewish groups who are supposed to care about Halakha, including Shvichut Damim, and abortion is clearly within the category of Shvichut Damim, it's a clear statement in the Gemara, did Orthodox groups come out on the side of the pro-life camp to ban those abortions that weren't allowed by Halakha, even for non-Jews? The answer is the Orthodox Union never commented on it publicly, never took a stance. Their position basically was that Judaism doesn't fit easily into the pro-life or pro-choice camp. And the Agudat Yisrael, the Yeshivish Oilams, right, the Yeshivish worlds, political group, political office would always side with the pro-choice camp. Pro-choice camp. Why? Why? The answer was, they said, we don't agree with how Roe v. Wade was decided. We think Roe v. Wade is too broad, but right, when it comes to issues of abortion, there are times when Jewish law will allow it. And when Jewish law does allow it, we want it to be safe and legal for our own people and for our own community. And we can keep it rare. This doesn't happen that often in our community. And the fact that it will be happen at great lengths and great extents in broader society, we have to protect our own interest. And they were very explicit about this. Now, exactly what happened last few years is complicated, but that was always their position. I want to share with you the position that was taken by Professor David Novak. The Canadians here, for those of you from Toronto, might know David from Shari Shemayim. He's sort of a member of the Mono-Orthodox community there. And David, for many, Professor Novak, I know personally, but Professor Novak, for many years has written about this issue. He has a small c conservative stance on the issue. And this is what he had to say about this topic. Okay, let's sit down here for a minute. And he says as follows. The tendency, and he's already said this in 1974, Jews especially, who have been the most tragic victims of the contempt for life, should be the last people in the world to support legislation that would give carte blanche and moral sanction to abortion. There are moral considerations that transcend even the fine points of the law, lest legal decisions be a respectable cover for immorality. What's he saying? You want a tight, you want this, you want to give me all your Talmudic pilpul about why it's not lifnei iver, why it's not a violation, this, that. Friends, this is a cover for immorality. And the tendency in Jewish law, goes on to say, has usually been to take a strict stand when general public morality has declined. The pro-abortion movement insists that abortion be permitted on demand. It is not concerned with the occasional dispensations allowed in Jewish law. The issue, therefore, is whether the unborn child has any rights at all. At a time when the hold of the Torah is so weak for so many of our people, we should by all means strengthen the only moral code many Jews still recognize, namely the law of the secular state. What do you say of this last line? That last paragraph is quite interesting. A, he says, don't allow the legalese of lifnei iver to allow you to think that we shouldn't care about what's going on. And B, you know what's going to happen if Jews don't take a stand against what he calls carte blanche access to abortion? Jews will do abortions. Because they don't care about Halakha, but they do care about the law of the secular state. Exactly what the Maram Shik said a couple hundred years before him. Okay, now, David's position on abortion is Professor Novak's position on abortion is complex and it's much more elaborate than that. But this is the point he tried to make already in the 70s. And I think the point he's trying to get at is as follows. You want to use all of your legalese and pilpul in order to show why Jews can live in a broader society and don't have to protest what's going on. Is that what Judaism is about? Does Judaism not having to say? And do you think this isn't going to impact how Jews behave as well? You're abandoning the mission of Judaism as a whole. Okay, now, leave aside the issue of abortion. Right? And I purposely picked that topic just to get you a little bit worked up, but not too worked up, right? In other words, I want you to understand the significance. And I'm like, oh, no, we're not talking about that. Sorry, just kidding. Right? But to make the broader point, of course, which is that what's at stake here, and this is it goes well beyond the questions of particular laws or legislative debates, whether it's about religious liberty, abortion, or guns, or a whole other slew of issues. The much broader question becomes, how do we as Jews see what Judaism has to say to us and to the world? And B, right, what should we do about it? Should we actively bring our religious views, our religiously inspired views, which can be rationalized, of course, but are certainly religiously inspired, should we bring that to the public sphere as well? And I think that there's a strong tendency in many circles to say, don't bring our Jewish convictions to the public sphere. It's a bad idea for a lot of reasons. I'm actually sympathetic, right, in some ways to that argument. But over the years, I've become much more sympathetic to the line of reasoning, which says, no, whether it's complicated and this is difficult, but Jews cannot shy away. A, because of our own interests, but B, because it's the sake of Judaism. Not just for the sake of Jews, but for the sake of Judaism. What does Judaism stand for? If we want Judaism to be meaningful, to have a mission, have actually a teaching to ourselves and to the world, we cannot keep Jewish ideas out of the public sphere. Right? And this is the premise, in some ways, of the course in terms of thinking this through. What would this look like? Right? What are the implications for this, for these very broad issues, which please God will be talking about in the coming weeks. Right? So I've set up here an argument and claim for what I think is true. But we're going to sort of work this out over the course of the next few weeks. Can we develop a idea of what Judaism has to say about end-of-life issues and what this means for the public sphere, or not? And the answer might be, good try. Well done, good try. But this is what the goal we're trying to accomplish, and some food for thought. Okay, let's take a look here. I see there's a whole bunch of people giving examples of thinking about questions of, the guns really got people going. Interesting. I wasn't expecting that. More than abortion, I guess. Who knew? Let's take a couple of questions here. If you want to use your hand signals here, or just raise your hand, we'll be happy to take a few here. Let's see.
I would just like to say that I'm going to copy the entire chat for you, Rabbi Brody, and I will send it to you in an email, okay? So that you can take a look over all the comments, and then maybe prior to the class starting next week, you'll be able to address anything that you've put in the chat, okay?
Perfect. Yeah, I want to mention something right now. Ellen, I'm going to call you in one moment, but Dennis here writes about the emphasis on the public sphere should not diminish the importance and quality of the private sphere. Oh, I agree with that 100%. Meaning we do need to carefully think about and teach within our own communities about how we behave, and that should be prioritized. And in fact, Rabbi George, who we quoted at the very beginning, stated the same thing. Law is not the only place, and even the primary place where you impact the public ecology. But it's not irrelevant. Okay, Ellen Hertzmark.
Sorry. I assume you'll get to this, but there about what kinds of arguments you use. I mean, just think how it sounds to the guy. Oh, well, I can do this because you're on this side of the river, but if you're on the other side of the river, I wouldn't be able to get into a boat and take it over to you. Like, give me a break. And I think in general, I mean, there's too much absolutism in at least United States morality discourse already, and to throw in some more absolutism, which, if you know anything about Talmudic law, there's always somebody who disagrees.
Yeah.
So nothing is absolute.
Yeah.
Ellen,
you're raising two important questions. I want to actually speak about the first one in particular. We are going to get to this, but the two sides of the river issue, I mean, obviously I wouldn't formulate it as two sides of the river, right? I know you get that, but let's take the following case, which is very, very, very real. I mean, it's not a made-up case at all. Let's say you're a physician with a long-time patient, and you're in country now, or a state. It could be California, it could be Canada, whatever it might be. And the patient says to you, listen, I like medical aid and diet, medical assistance and diet. There are other ways of doing this, other doctors around. I very much think that Jewish doctors, not just Jewish doctors, not just for religious reasons, for other reasons of conscience, should be able to say, right, well, I'm not willing to do that. Even though, I know, you can do this on your own, or you can have someone else do it. I don't have anything to do with it. And actually, it's interesting, the Catholics in Canada, the Catholic movement, the church in Canada has been pushing not just that the Catholic doctors shouldn't have to do it, the Catholic doctors shouldn't even have to refer people to another physician that will do it. Because they were saying, we have a right to have a moral stance. We're not going to have anything to do with this. So, how you formulate the two rivers, I think is an interesting question, and we will get to it. But I do think it's an important concept, that we should think about. Your point about absolutism, of course, is important as well, right? So in the liberal political sphere, we all need to live with each other. How do we do that in a good, healthy, pluralistic society is, of course, a challenge. Okay, Shelley Shapiro.
We don't have the same idea of what morality is, because we've got that with COVID too. My right to decide about my body and make my own choices based on the internet, if I think that's better than science, over what might be better for the community in general. So the prevailing morality now is I should get to make my own choices, which I'm sure comes up all the time in these end-of-life issues. Why should I have to listen to any religion, or why should I have to listen to anything like that? Let me make the decision. I'm a rational person. If I want to kill myself, I can kill myself.
Right. So, you're raising a very interesting point, which is that and this is true in general in the West today, the value of autonomy, and this isn't just in medical care, right? This is in many other realms as well, not just in abortion or end-of-life issues, right? But the value of autonomy.
Volume went way down.
Sorry, my volume go? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Sorry. So the issue of autonomy has become very, central to much of our public moral discourse. But there's a temptation to say, listen, autonomy is neutral. It just allows people to do what they want to do, as that's not harming someone else. But one of the things I believe to be true is that autonomy is not neutral. It's not value neutral. Right? When you're allowing in your society certain actions to happen which you think are immoral, that could be gun sales, right? I'm not picking one side of the political spectrum or another here. Right? I don't mean by any means to do that, right? But when you are allowing people to have rights, saying they have the right to choose, in a lot of different areas, that has a moral impact, has an impact on the moral ecology. And so the whole notion of autonomy being promoted because we all have different values is problematic. It might be the best solution in a pluralistic society. Maybe it is. That's part of the conversation. But I think that it comes with a lot of cost as well. Ellie Passo.
It's actually Chaya Paso. And didn't I teach
Chaya.
your son in first grade?
Could be. Yeah.
Philadelphia. Anyway.
That's my nephew. But go ahead. Yeah.
Your nephew. Okay. Anyway, no, it seems to me that there is a fringe benefit to what you suggested at the end. Just as you said that if that the values, the way they used to be put was in other words, what the Christians do is what the Jews tend to copy. So as you said, morality in the non-Jewish sphere will impact. I think if as you suggest, or as a possibility, that our values that we hold very strongly and are generally may more or less unanimous about, can go out there and be vocalized and publicized, other Jews will learn about Judaism through that. I think there are so many Jews in America who have no idea about what Jews believe about almost anything. And it's very possible that in what would you suggest would also have an educational aspect to it. Do you think that that's so?
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. In general, if you want Jews to be proud of their Judaism, you have to be able to, be able to publicize it and speak of it proudly. It reminds me, by the way, that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter in the late 19th century was in favor of teaching Talmud in non-Jewish universities in Europe. And he's in favor of it, which seems to go against the Gemara, whatever. There's a whole discussion about this topic. I've written about it somewhere. If you look at, you search my name, you'll find it. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's explanation is very simple. If the non-Jews start learning Talmud, maybe the Jews will start learning Talmud as well. Right, so there is something to say for that. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. But again, how you do that has to be very wise. And one of the concerns that comes up is you can't just say this is the Shita of Tosfot, and therefore that's why we believe this. Right, so you have to go through a whole process of translating, so to speak, and explaining and articulating what Judaism might have to say on various topics, which is much harder than teaching a law. I want to explain, this is important to mention. You could say something's a law. Jews do certain rituals. That doesn't mean it has an ethical teaching. Right? If you want to say something has an ethical teaching, you have to be able to translate that into ethical discourse. Otherwise, it's just, a code, what people do. So one of the challenges that we have is once you start making ethical arguments and rational discourse, people are going to have rational counter arguments. Right? And so one of the reasons why Jews are wearisome of getting involved in the public debate is that it exposes us to other arguments. And it might even expose us to weaknesses in our own arguments, which sometimes can make people feel uncomfortable. I get it. I understand. Right? It makes me sometimes feel uncomfortable too. But maybe that's what the mission of Judaism calls for. But that is a hard process. So, you take the example, we'll just pick abortion because we're talking about it. So, in classic Jewish law, there's this distinction of development, the fetal development, before 40 days, after 40 days. It's a little complex, but let's just, maybe people are like, what's the difference to 40 days? Why does 40 days matter? Like, what happened to 40 days? And the Catholics are like, this is just based on old ancient science. You thought there's nothing going on in the mother's womb, it's Maya Ba'alma, it's just water. It turns out we know exactly how fetal development works, and that starts at conception. And many on the other side say, like, why 40 days? Like, why not 50 days? Why not 60 days? Like, we can come up, maybe it should be viability, right? 5 months in, whatever it is, right? So that exposes Jews to a lot of complex questions. Okay, we have to decide, right? Do we want how we want to see our religion? Is it just a code, a ritual, a law, or is it an ethics? Anyone else? I'm trying to see if I have any more hands. Okay, Lauren Blatt, last question. I mean, I'll stay on forever. I don't care, but go ahead.
Okay, just two very quick things. One, a lot of people misrepresent medically assisted death in Canada. I've been involved with it because a friend of mine chose it, and not every physician does it. It's become kind of a specialty. The other thing is the things that you're mentioning, like you're not mentioning ethics. I mean, I'm thinking very particularly, what does it show the world? What does it show fellow Jews when a Haredi criminal is yet again put as a minister of the interior, and he stole from that ministry twice? And that's really more bothering to me than whether somebody has an affair, that's their business. But to have like a representative of government to be in jail and convicted twice and then to become a minister, that is a shanda.
Yeah, I mean, the point of bringing morality to the public sphere you got to be consistent. I agree with this point. I mean, leaving aside the particular case you're giving and how that should work. I mean, that case in particular in Israel is an interesting moral question of should we have leaders? Can leaders repent? Okay. I'm not saying, I don't want to get into the details of whether that particular leader has repented or admitted or this or that. But a bunch of years ago, during a certain made tshuva, the New York City had its mayoral primaries. And there's a bunch of candidates then who all had their affairs and this or that who were running after during a certain made tshuva. And I wrote about this issue then. I think it's in Tablet, where I try to talk about, what should be our standards for leaders. So I agree with you that if you're going to bring morality to the public sphere, you can't be pick and choose. You can't pick and choose. And part of the issue that Jews have is that when you look at the way that people think about what are the religious stances or the issues, the social issues that religious people care about, it sort of gets dominated by the agenda of, let's say in the United States, by Catholics and Southern Baptists or evangelicals. I don't know, maybe Jewish religious activism should care about the environment and gun control. Or should care about all those issues. And then that would make things complicated because the left and the right are all whatever, this or that. So you're raising all the interesting questions here. And I think these are important questions to ask. But if we don't ask these questions, then we're gonna become irrelevant to society and to ourselves as well. So these are complicated questions, and I'm looking forward to continuing to explore them as we go along in the coming weeks.
Baruch Hashem. Excellent, Rabbi. Thank you.
Brody.
Thank you so much. I'll hang on here, but you all feel free to walk off, and I can take up more questions if I have time.
And just,
Rabbi Sam. Sure.
there is an extensive chat, and like I said to everybody who wrote into the chat, I will share that with Rabbi Brody, so he gets a chance to see everybody's comments and questions, and we can address some of that at the beginning of class as well next week. Okay.
I just
Excellent.
want to say that I'm very grateful. This is Rabbi Sachs. I'm very grateful for this class.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the future.
Me too. Thank you so much. Thanks for kind words.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brody. It's Rabbi Brody. I just want to say so many times, as Jews, we feel very comfortable in our environment, and we believe that we can just go on, the way we are, and we don't have to get involved in the world around us. Not realizing that, in fact, if we don't care about the world around us, that slowly the influences the influences out there are going to impact us. And so to hear you say that was pretty good. And I think we need to be very much aware of what's happening around us and try to make a difference, be a light unto the nation, and be involved to keep
I
ourselves.
appreciate it. I appreciate saying, Faye. I mean, yeah, this issue does in many ways get to the core of how Jews see themselves in the societies in which they live. Because if you feel very comfortable in that society, then you're gonna feel like you're a member of society, you should have your opinions, and you should be, outspoken about it.
Right.
If you're feeling nervous for various reasons, then you might say, listen, this is not really our interest to get involved here.
That's right.
So
you're saying basically it's their world and this is my world. I'm very comfortable in my world. What do I care about what's happening around me? But eventually,
yes, but
you're going to get absorbed in it.
right. But some people will say it's in Jewish interest to keep a low profile because it's not in our interest to get involved in the political back and forth that could, harm our political and social status in ways that Jews are vulnerable for. Maybe they're right. Just that'd be a sad statement about where Jews stand in the world. Maybe they're right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Faye.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Rabbi Brody, we'll see you next week.
Looking
Shavua tov,
forward.
everyone.
Go to.